But one question this panel is supposed to address, and that's the students themselves. And Robert, you've alluded to this a couple of times here, and what they're supposed to be taught. The Financial Times just this week reports that universities across 4 continents, including this one, are rolling out this revamped economics curriculum after students protested they weren't getting the right stuff, and that means problems befalling the global economy. So what do you think? I mean, how is the next generation of economists supposed to spot the next crisis, much less prevent it, if things like private sector debt aren't on the table and there's this question of what students are being taught? And Bruce, why don't you grab the microphone and go with that?
All right. I mean, I can tell you what I think they ought to be taught, that they're not. I suspect it's not going to be what they're taught. And it's not, I think as we sit here today, the analysis that people have of how to solve this crisis is completely misguided, because it's focused on fixing the financial system that is like trying to revive Archduke Ferdinand. Once the war is out there, it's the structural factors that take over. But let's just talk about, I'll give you a list. For all the students here, these are things you should never forget. Markets are not efficient. Financial markets are not efficient in any conceivable sense. And if you recognize systematic patterns of inefficiency, which is what I spend my life teaching, you will not only maybe forecast the next recession, but you'll get very rich in the meantime. There are systematic, flawed human behaviors when it comes to operating in financial markets that we've probably inherited from our hunter-gatherer periods that you've got to learn are out there. So again, it's a behavioral aspect of humans operating within economies that you have to pay attention to. Second thing is that you've got to remember some history. One of the most remarkable things I think about the Great Moderation was at how it moderated economic memory out of existence, that people forgot what business cycles looked like. So all of a sudden, they, after the fact, rediscover balance sheet cycles when in the 50s, 60s, and in this audience by Timon Minsky in the 70s and early 80s, all cycles were balance sheet cycles. So that's the second thing I think you should do. I would not exaggerate the importance of financial markets. Now, financial markets are exciting, and people in financial markets make a lot of money that they don't deserve, and they're really exciting people and enjoyable people to despise, and that all has a really attractive, distortive effect on your view of the world. And I think that's what's going on now. I mean, you look at what economies have suffered. What economy do you think has suffered most in this crisis? Which are the 2 big drops and slowest recoveries? Japan and Finland. And they're 2 countries that had nothing like financial crises. They had other structural problems that we could talk about. In Europe, the financial crisis comes incredibly late in the game. It is a cause, not a source of what's going on. So I would focus on the behavior of operating firms, of households consuming, of things like the distribution of income, and I would shy away from something that I think has been intensified by this crisis, which is this focus on finance. The fourth thing is that you have to talk about institutions. You have to talk about institutional behavior, how firms behave, how households behave. And you have to talk about it in empirical detail. And I'll give you an example of a talk this afternoon, and this is a very, I think, advanced audience in terms of teaching people what is important about economics. That was completely off point. Everybody is worried about household debt levels and whether household debt levels are having a depressive effect on consumption these days. You can actually measure that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports disposition of household income, and they break it down into expenditures and consumption and savings. The difference between expenditures and consumption, which runs only about 1.5% a year, is household interest payments, consumer interest payments, which is the burden on these debts other than the cost of housing, and transfers overseas. That number is not only tiny, but because interest rates have been falling, it has been falling dramatically. You have to understand that, because otherwise you're going to be worried about things like household debt burdens, as a very intelligent economist here was. So you've got to look at the empirical dimensions of institutions in a way that we don't teach them to look at it, including households, including banks, and including firms. Now, when you look at firms, I think one of the things that we teach people, and will continue to teach people, is that interest rates matter. There is enormous discussion of interest rates. They do matter for the distribution of income, but nobody has ever been able to detect an interest rate effect on demand for investment or household savings. That risk perceptions dominate among institutions their concerns in making investment decisions. And you have to teach people that and forget about the R variable that you have in your models, and I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. What that means in turn is that when you talk about monetary policy, you cannot talk about it in the abstract. Monetary institutions matter a lot. The institutional form of banking systems matter a tremendous amount. I think it's fair to say that across the world, whether it's Abenomics, the European Central Bank, or the U.S. Fed, there is no significant evidence that they've had a positive effect. In fact, how they defend themselves is they, oh, if we hadn't done this, we would have had a depression. But again, you can look at countries that didn't do it, and they didn't have depressions. Successful monetary interventions with the institutions we now have in place do not look like traditional monetary policy. They look like what the Swedes did in the middle 1990s when they had a tremendous problem that they solved, what the Koreans did in the wake of the Asia crisis, which is direct recapitalization of the banks. So I think it is that emphasis on understanding markets are imperfect, understanding the nature of history, understanding the structure of institutions, and looking at the empirical regularities that are staring us in the face of things like the effect of the distribution of income on U.S. household savings.